Denver Broncos tight end Greg Dulcich, his stock is falling after the Broncos offseason program because he simply wasn't available. How much room can he make up for it in training camp? We'll break that down and tell you why he can on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's up? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day, whether you listen to us wherever you get your podcast or if you watch us on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, the site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. We appreciate you, Broncos Country. And look, last week we kind of finalized the end of mandatory minicamp with a stock rising, 3 players whose stock rose after the offseason program, including OTAs and mandatory minicamp. Today's episode is really going to focus on whose stock is falling. Now, while the stock isn't necessarily falling, we have question marks about the Broncos off-ball linebacker position. Javonte Williams, we got to see a little bit more, hopefully, here in training camp. But we're going to kick things off by talking about Greg Dulcich. His lack of availability during the offseason program is something that has led to his stock declining a little bit, especially at the rise of some other players at the position. So, Sayre, let's kick things off here talking about Greg Dulcich here. Really not his fault. And I always have to preface this conversation when we're talking about players who are injured. It's never the player's fault that they're injured. But I think when we're just looking at, okay, who has the most to prove now going into training camp? Well, because his stock is fallen a little bit here, Greg Dulcich is one of those guys we're going to have our eyes on here. But his lack of availability in the offseason program, definitely not a good sign for him when we're looking at our overall stock report here for the Broncos.
No, it's not. I mean, this isn't a Ja'Wuan James situation, right? I think a lot of times from the fans' perspective, like players get treated the way that, Ja'Wuan James kind of treated his injury, and his status. And remember the whole snafu between him and Vic Fangio, where he was healthy to play and Vic was having to say and explain yeah, he's okay. He just, he was basically trying to say he doesn't want to play. He doesn't feel comfortable enough to play. That's not the case with Greg Dulcich. It's not like he's healthy and doesn't want to be out there to risk the injury. Like you said, Cody, he wants to be out there desperately. And Sean Payton has reiterated this multiple times that Dulcich, more than anybody, is frustrated this offseason because he just wants to be out there. He wants to be competing. We saw glimpses of him. Obviously he was out on the side field. He was out there at the UCLA Pro Day way earlier this offseason, kind of just hanging out and watching things. And so we know Dulcich is hopefully in as good a spirits as possible, but he had the foot procedure after, I guess it was almost exactly 2 years ago at this time, his rookie minicamp, where the hype train was a rolling and all of a sudden he suffers a hamstring injury at offseason activities. And that's really lingered for over a year and a half. And it's kind of crazy to think about at this stage because those hamstring injuries, we always say they can be tricky, but man, you don't expect them to necessarily last that long or to linger that long, to be a problem for that long. So you have the hamstring on top of now the foot surgery that he had. And Sean Payton said he was close to coming back, but you can't help but be a little disappointed that the guy wasn't able to be out there and, working with Bo Nix, working with Jarrett Stidham and Zach Wilson and getting reps out there and showing off his athleticism, showing off his strong hands, getting people excited about the potential of what he could bring to the offense. I think that's the tension right now is that nobody in Broncos country really knows, should we even be excited about Greg Dulcich this year? And that's a tough part because it's not anything personal against him. It's just you want to get excited about the team. The guy's not able to be out there with the team. So I get the tension that exists between kind of, wanting to see him out there and him not being able to be. It's going to be a tough wait to see him back out on the field.
Well, and that now accelerates, I think, things in terms of, okay, where does he need to be? How can he maybe improve from where he's at? Because look, the reality is he's behind. He's getting a lot of mental reps. He's getting in the playbook. He's in the film. He's in the meeting rooms. That's a benefit to have. Obviously, that's great. But being able to go out there and start carrying out the physical process of running routes, hitting your landmarks there, or understanding hey, I can see myself in this position, and then starting to be able to be used that way. the reason I mentioned that his stock is really falling is not necessarily due to the fact that, he's still recovering from, offseason foot surgery. It's because other guys are starting to emerge at the position. For example, Lucas Kroll has had a terrific offseason here for the Broncos, has looked like the best tight end on the field in almost every practice that we've gone to, and is being utilized by Sean Payton. And then Adam Troutman, as we all know, veteran, reliable option there. He had a good OTAs before he came up with a core muscle strain that held him out of mandatory minicamp. And in his absence, I would say Nate Adkins is a guy who deserves some props. I saw a lot out of Nate Adkins during his time of getting reps in place of where normally Adam Troutman would be in terms of the Broncos' current rotation at the tight end position. And so the more and more that these guys ahead of him who have been there have been getting all the on-field reps, continue to get work. And if he's not ready for the start of training camp, I really think that's the biggest start of the timeline. Is Greg Dulcich going to be dressed on day one of Broncos training camp? To me, that is a huge, huge component of this factor. And Sayre, if he's not dressed for that specific day in general, he's going to have a long uphill climb in order to, I think, even make the roster at this point, considering where Denver's at. But there's also a reality to where even if he is not ready to go, and even if he doesn't do much in training camp, there's still a chance he could sit on the roster, maybe be on the roster because of where Denver's tight end depth is ultimately. Are they comfortable moving in with Lucas Kroll, Adam Troutman, and Nate Adkins solely as their top three guys? I mean, that's an interesting dynamic. I don't know how the Broncos feel about that, but I think on paper, Broncos country would not feel good about that either.
No, I can't. I don't think so. I think that would be a situation where you're like, writing up the hypothetical trade situations, looking at who's available in free agency, who could get cut, things like that, just because you really need to have better depth at the position. And it is an important position to Sean Payton. Historically speaking, it's a very, very important position to him. We did all this research after Payton was initially hired, looking at, the investments in guys like, if you go all the way back to Dan Campbell, 3rd round, Jason Witten, 3rd round, and those guys, how important they became to his offense. Then with the Saints, they trade for Jeremy Shockey, they bring in Jimmy Graham and have all these other Jared Cook, like all these other guys. Like the tight end position is critically important to Sean Payton's offense. And so you have to think that they would supplement the depth somehow. One day that time period that I kind of have circled as well, Cody, is to see maybe a little trailer before the movie, right? Maybe Greg shows up at these workouts that are being planned, I believe in Texas, where, Jarrett Stidham and some of the other players are organizing stuff. Maybe Greg shows up to those and is able to be out there and working out with the guys. I think that would be, not that there's going to be a film crew following him around, but maybe we at least catch wind or get a photo or something like that he's out there. And I think that would be maybe our biggest sign so far that he is going to be ready to go at training camp. So that's kind of, at least we won't have to necessarily wait about 6 weeks at this point, right? Until training camp starts. We may just be able to know in about 3 weeks whether or not Greg is going to be out there. And I hope that he is. I hope that he's able, because man, he's such a difference maker when he's able to play. And so, yes, stock is down right now. There's no question. We have to be honest about it. We can't just sit here and say, well, you can't be mad at Greg. He doesn't want to be injured. And I think that's valid. But you're right, Cody. His stock is down because of this lack of availability.
The good thing about stocks and the reports and things like that, they sometimes go up, they go down, they peak a little bit straight there. It's a whirlwind of peaks and valleys here. And hopefully Greg Dulcich can be on our stock rising once we get to training camp. And once we get through the first week of training camp, whose stock will rise in that regard. He's one of the players we'll have our eyes on. We hope to see him on the field here very soon for Broncos country. Even though that Javonte is fully healthy coming off of a year where he was really trying to get ingrained back into the process, his stock is a little bit down after mandatory minicamp and OTAs. Can he climb back up the ladder as well? We'll break that down and much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos country, today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And as you all know, FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. And right now, they want you to enjoy your summer. Yes, that's right. Summertime means baseball. It means the NBA Finals and more. And you can bet it all on FanDuel. And right now, new customers, they get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Once again, that's right. New customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet that you can place on baseball games. You got basketball games coming up for the Olympics. You got a whole bunch of stuff coming up when it comes to sports, including the NFL season right around the corner. So once again, that's $200 you can use to bet on everything from the finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook.
Denver Broncos running back Javonte Williams is facing a critical training camp. We're going to tell you exactly why he needs to have a big camp when the pads come on, maybe even a big preseason because of all the competition at the running back position this year. We're going to talk about that and more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, but want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you who make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, free and available everywhere that you get your podcasts. And look, you can also subscribe on YouTube, and we appreciate you for doing exactly that today. There's a growing community over there on YouTube. And you know what you could do after you listen to Locked On Broncos on YouTube or watch Locked On Broncos on YouTube? You can make a switch from any national sports media show that you've been watching, sites and networks that don't cover the teams in depth. You can make the switch to Locked On Sports today and get some more curated sports coverage, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that's programmed for you every day to bring you all the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, and news. Locked On Sports today is streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Javonte Williams was a second round pick by George Paton in his first draft class, traded up to get him. Looked like after the 2021 season, like, man, the Broncos might have the next best young running back on their roster. Unfortunately, an injury caused things to take a dramatic turn for the worse in 2022. We saw Javonte back in 2023, sort of a miraculous time. That was a big talking point for us last year, wasn't it, Cody, when he came back? Because we were like, I don't know if he's going to be there at the start of the regular season, and then he's back at OTAs. So Javonte didn't look good at the end of last season at all, and it was tough to watch, honestly, because of what we know he's capable of doing. How do you feel about how he did at OTAs as compared to the other running backs? And why do you think, I mean, we're saying that his stock is down. So why do you think that we can accurately characterize Javonte Williams right now as a stock down player for the Broncos?
Well, I think really the emergence of Jaleel McLaughlin, who in our last episode of Locked On Broncos, we talked about stock rising. He looked terrific throughout training camp. And you start to see Blake Watson make a little bit of noise during OTAs and obviously at the end of mandatory minicamp as well. And so now I think you look at the widespread role of the running back position. Like, obviously, it's very important for Sean Payton to have a sustainable run game. And a lot of the players are excited that, hey, the offensive scheme, like, we're in it for a second year. Now we're a little more comfortable. It's not changing. I don't have to think as much about learning a new system. Like, there's these little intricacies that go into it. But I would say right now, stock is only down here for Javonte because of the rise of some other guys at the position. Obviously, the writing on the wall in terms of, okay, hey, Denver's evaluating everything after they went out and they drafted Audric Estime out of Notre Dame. And look, they got him in the 5th round, but they had a higher round grade on him. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, didn't Sean say he had a 3rd round grade on Estime when they were going through their scouting and their background process? He's expected to be ready for the start of training camp, a player to watch, obviously, but he's a big bruising back. And I think ideally in a perfect world, you and I were talking about it. Okay, well, if the Broncos roll with Javonte Williams with his run after the catch, running through contact, yards after contact ability, Audric Estime, let's say hypothetically it was Jaleel McLaughlin as that change of pace flash guy, I felt like we're like, hey, that's a pretty good running back room here for the Broncos. Samaje Perine is still on the roster here at this point. Blake Watson's a guy who's really trying to emerge as well and stood out a little bit on special teams during OTAs and mandatory minicamp. I just say right now there's just a lot of competition at the position, which I think makes it even more crucial for Javonte to have a really good training camp, right? And for us to be able to talk about the running back position right now, from what I saw from Javonte at OTAs and minicamp, there were times where, runs got stuffed. Granted, guys aren't wearing pads. The offensive line isn't able to impose their will. The defensive line isn't able to really impose their will as well. You have to run by guys. I would say I saw Javonte featured a lot more as a pass catcher out of the backfield than we saw in terms of him running. I don't know if that's by design by Sean Payton, monitoring his reps when he's in. I still know that the team wants to be smart with Javonte and how they bring him about. Like, I don't think they're going to throw a heavy workload on him right away. Like, he's still a guy in that 2-year window where, hey, you just came off of a major knee injury. We want to be able to preserve your legs for the regular season as well. So I think it's a little bit of everything there. But because of that, I also think that means that the stock is down a little bit. It's not necessarily a negative thing. It just means I think going into training camp, there might be a little bit more pressure here on Javonte.
And I think even extending into preseason games, I mean, you don't expect a lot of times to see the starters go deep into the preseason. I'm not saying Javonte is going to go deep or anything into the preseason games, but you do want to see, as this offensive line has built up continuity since last year. I mean, 4 of the 5 starters from last year, they're back. It's only the center position that's changing. You expect that the blocking schemes to be on point, and you expect Javonte going into the second year of an offense to be really understanding of, exactly where the blocking scheme is going to be set up, when to attack those gaps and things like that. Those things have to be on point during the preseason from him. It can't be a matter of, man, he's just not hitting the holes with confidence. He's not, it's not even about the yardage after contact for me at this point. It's going to be a big factor, but it's really more so about can he carry the every down workload? Because right now, who do the Broncos have that can do that other than Audric Estime, who did it at Notre Dame recently? I mean, Samaje Perine didn't even have barely, I think, 50 some odd touches or carries last year. He had almost 100 touches total, but didn't have even 100 carries for this team. And Jaleel McLaughlin carried the ball quite a bit, but not in a featured runner type of role. Javonte is the only guy that really has done that at the NFL level in terms of like recently carrying the full load for an offense and for a team that wants to establish an identity on the ground. He's the guy, other than Estime, who missed OTAs because he was injured. And so he's another wild card at this point, no matter what grade the Broncos had on him. So Javonte, to me, has to prove that he can be that every down guy. We know he can, we know he can catch passes if he's given enough opportunities. We know he can pass protect. Like, he'll stick his face mask in there and do the dirty work. Can he be the every down ball carrier to keep that running game going and to get it, frankly, to a much better point than it was last season?
Part of me also feels like the Broncos and Sean Payton may be moving away from the every down ball carrier mentality. I mean, right now, I think across the NFL, we are starting to see a little bit more of an embracement on running back by committee. And look, I don't think it hurts to have a guy like Javonte or an Estime or a P. Ryan or a Jaleel or a Blake Watson. It's just, okay, how do you manufacture touches for them? And I think it's more situational now than it is like every down. And I go back to when Audric was drafted and we talked to Sean Payton. Sean said, the vision for him is first and second down. Okay, well, what does that mean? Is that an indictment on Javonte? I don't think it is, because even last year in certain games, there were times where Jaleel McLaughlin was the first running back on the field. Like, he was getting the first carry of the game. He was getting the first snap of the game, even though he wasn't necessarily listed as the starter. So to me, I think Sean doesn't necessarily buy too much into this guy's going to be our every down back. I think he plans to use a multitude of guys. I think you'll see 3 or 4 total running backs on the roster. You may see 1 guy on the practice squad here. But I also think that for Sean, where he's at, knowing Javonte and the history he's got, obviously coming off the knee injury, Denver may find more effectiveness out of Javonte in the run game if they do decide to just say, hey, you know what, we're going to mix and match our personnel based on situation, side of the field, hash, left hash, right hash, whatever, balls in the middle of the field. They may change up the overall philosophy. And I think, like, even Mencken mentioned too, I'll bring up the Baltimore Ravens here, right? Obviously, we know they have Lamar Jackson, unbelievable talent. They just acquired Derrick Henry. But from all sides, even from what Derrick Henry has said, it's like, it's nice not to be like the primary guy anymore. I don't even think that Derrick Henry is going to be the every down back for them. I think they're going to find a way in Baltimore to utilize a multitude of guys, including Henry. I mean, you have to worry about the speed and elusiveness of Lamar Jackson and the physicality of a guy like Derrick Henry. Well, then you have some other guys that can come in and also change the pace for you. That wears you down. That creates sustainability. I think the Broncos offense may be trying to get to that point as well. So while Javonte hasn't necessarily had the greatest, most visible offseason program, he still may be a very big part of the team's game plan going forward. And we're going to wait for training camp to come out to see how it plays out here, the NFL preseason. competition aplenty, running back being one of them, according to Sean Payton. So the pressure is on everybody, including Javonte Williams this offseason. Now, while the stock may not necessarily be down, the perception of an unsteady market at the linebacker position, off ball in particular, is one that we're monitoring here in terms of a question mark coming into training camp here. We'll talk about why we think that position might have to have some time to work itself out here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. The off-ball linebacker position is a big question mark as we talk about our Denver Broncos stock report after mandatory minicamp and OTAs here. But real quick, before we dive deep into that conversation, I want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, you can get us for free on YouTube, or you can get us wherever you listen to your podcast. Make sure if you're listening to 1 or 2 episodes a week, why don't you bump that up to 5 episodes per week? Because we got coverage every single day, all year long, fresh and objective coverage, new topics, new conversations, new talking points every day that you cannot get anywhere else. We truly keep Broncos fans informed from the start of the season through the end of the season, throughout the entire offseason. That's what we bring to the table here, Locked On Broncos here. Sayre, speaking of bringing things to the table here, we know that Alex Singleton is going to be the Broncos starter at linebacker in 2024. His number one thing that he said that he hopes for this year, he says, I hope we don't suck. Like, that's the thing. Like, that was his biggest hope and his biggest goal, is that they don't suck, because they got off to such a terrible start last year. He mentioned a lot of that was due to mixing what Ejiro Evero did, Vic Fangio's defense, with obviously a little bit of Vance Joseph's, and that things just didn't mesh well. Then they made the change, and all of a sudden they started to find spark. Everyone keeps saying, well, that was a lucky run. I don't believe in luck in football. I think the idea that you believe in luck for a stretch like that is realistic. You never played. Like, the reality is, you go out there, there's no such thing as luck. There's execution, there's determination, there's effort. Like, there's all these things that make that up. And the Broncos, I think the defense at various points last year, they were one of the best defenses in football. Then they went through their highs and lows. We're talking about stock reports, right? Climbing and falling. Denver's defense did that a little bit. Now, while we talk about linebacker here, Sayre, I don't necessarily think that the stock is necessarily down. It's kind of uncertain. We don't know where it can go. It could go up, it could go down. It's kind of in the middle here. But right now, the Broncos have a multitude of players that they're trying to figure out how to fit or fill the void left by Josey Jewell's departure in NFL free agency.
Josey Jewell out of the building, and you wonder, like, how much did Drew Sanders factor into this position group? At this point, it's impossible to know, because the Sean Payton, George Payton, they both said similar things, where he could play off-ball linebacker, he could play off the edge. So it's tough to know exactly how much they planned on him playing at this position group, but they went out, signed Cody Barton in free agency to a pretty modest deal, not necessarily screaming starter money with signing him, but although he could end up starting. Jonas Griffith was brought back. Justin Sternad was brought back. Actually, they stole him back. I believe he was going to sign with the Panthers as well before they brought him back. So they brought Sternad back. You go out, and they didn't do anything in the NFL draft. They signed a couple guys that they believe in after the draft, including Lavelle Bailey out of Fresno State, who recently got a shout out from Sean Payton. Now you just signed Andre Smith, who was a tryout player at mandatory minicamp, and he's got some experience. He played, actually, last year, he played in Atlanta for Ryan Nielsen, who was formerly on Sean Payton's staff in New Orleans. So interesting connection there that you wonder about. But to me, Cody, it's yes, there's names, there's guys who have played. There's even Cody Barton, who has, I think, multiple years in a row of over 100 tackles, 100 plus tackles, something like that. Jonas Griffith has looked good in the past. Everything at this position is such a wild card. And that's what I think you're saying exactly when you talk about, we don't know stock up, stock down at this point. The only reason why we may assume stock down is because it's an unknown. It's very similar to what it was when Josey Jewell was the starter, and you had Alex Singleton and Jonas Griffith competing in camp, and nobody knew what are you going to get from either of those guys? Are they even anything more than special teamers? So it's a very similar situation, and you need somebody when the pads come on. Somebody's going to have to be out there emerging as that consistent playmaker at this position, who's able to really feed off the energy of the defensive line, attack the line of scrimmage, and play well off of Alex Singleton and what he does best.
And also with the new special teams rules and kickoff, kick return, I mean, could you see the Broncos carry more inside linebackers, off-ball linebackers on their roster because those body types typically fit well to what you want to do on special teams? Justin Sternad was the second highest graded Bronco on their special teams unit in terms of points accumulated last year in their own internal grading system. He's very valued. Ben Kotwica, Mike Westhoff really like Justin Sternad. Cody Barton has got great special teams ability as well. You don't want to put Alex Singleton out there, even though you know Alex Singleton could be one of the best special teams players. He was before he rose into a starting role here for Denver. Jonas Griffith, like all these guys too, like we're going to have to factor in at linebacker. If you have your two starters, one of your starters also still might have to play some special team snaps for you. But your two back end guys, like if you're going too deep specifically, those guys are going to have to be starters on special teams for you as core four players. So, okay, I look at that. And right now, okay, you look at Andre Smith, not a lot of starting experience at inside linebacker in the NFL, played a lot of special teams, entering his 7th year in the National Football League to be exact. He's appeared in 62 career games. And you have to wonder, okay, can he upend one of those guys? I don't know. I mean, it's certainly possible. He's a guy who's bounced around from a few teams from time to time. I think Justin Sternad has the advantage of being in here, knowing it, being a little bit younger in that regard. Cody Barton's obviously a guy who can do that. But then like Lavelle Bailey, like is there more upside with a guy like Lavelle Bailey who is young, has developmental talent that can still be molded a little bit in comparison to a veteran guy like Smith? Like Smith's going to come in, he's going to compete during training camp, but he's going to compete for the starting job. I don't necessarily think that's the case. If we look at his overall body of work so far, special teams could be the bigger need here. And they could carry, like I said, I think you and I maybe project, we'll see where we get as we get to training camp. But I feel like in our roster projection last year, didn't we have 5 off-ball linebackers on the roster in totality just in case? I think that's where we were at. Maybe that, maybe even one more guy depending on special teams. I mean, really, that's the wild card in this whole situation, not just for linebacker, but for almost every other position that we're talking about too.
And I think loading up, to your point, Cody, loading up on the practice squad with these guys who can be called up each week, and you can, use it 2 or 3 times. I think I can't remember what they changed it to last year. If you can call a guy up 2 times without, having to subject him to waivers, or 3, we'll have to wait and see what the NFL says this year, I guess. But either way, to your point of loading up at that position, having those guys on the practice squad, having those guys available as extensions of your roster, because it is so important. Special teams is so important. And that's going to be a really fascinating wrinkle when it comes to who wins the starting job, because we know, like Sean Payton said, they value Cody Barton as a core special teams guy. So if he's starting at off-ball linebacker, is he still going to play special teams? We know there was a big debate about that with Josie Jewell a couple years ago when he got injured. So that's going to be fascinating to watch. Where do you prioritize that? Because that is now such a big play. You got to have your best guys out there to cover kickoff returns. I mean, you can't risk and not having the best guys out there at times until like, okay, how's this going to go? How are our guys going to go out there and actually make these plays? Because it's a much tougher play now than it was before. So it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. And I don't know if Andre Smith is the last guy the Broncos are going to add at this position group. It could be interesting to watch unfold. There's still a few names out there in free agency of guys that, could get picked up before training camp. So we'll kind of have to wait and see, especially if these guys are meant to be assets on special teams. Like you could have a murderer's row Yankees, old school Yankees lineup of special teams linebackers with Barton, Griffith, and Andre Smith coming in. And Andre Davis, a former Bronco, by the way, but having all those guys out there, Justin Sternad as well, and having those guys out there and not having to worry about, Singleton and whoever else it ends up being. It's a fun question, because you love the options the Broncos have. But when we talk about kind of what are some fans maybe worried about right now, you can see why this position group would be cause for a bit of concern.
Yeah, and I think when you look at other players, other positions that are on the Broncos defense right now, I mean, not really a lot of questions at edge, not really a lot of questions right now on the defensive line based on what we've seen. It's been nice to see the defensive line kind of look like they can hold their own there, and especially with some of the guys, the new additions of JFM. Angelo Blackson's had a really good offseason. You look at Malcolm Roach having a good offseason as well. I mean, they're loaded up right there, and they got good depth cornerback, a lot of exciting young options with positional versatility. Safety, maybe a little bit of a question here, but I'm not as worried about that. I think really right now the biggest question for this team is that inside linebacker next to Alex Singleton. Who emerges of all those guys that we named? That is why I think we have that kind of on the stock, like we're going to stay steady here. Is it going to go down? Is it going to go up? training camp will give us a little bit of an answer on that here. But Broncos Country, that will wrap up today's episode of the show here, Locked on Broncos. For all you everydayers out there, after OTAs and minicamp, we're still talking about players. There are 3 players on the Broncos offensive side of the ball, 3 young players to be exact, that we have our eyes on as under-the-radar names to keep an eye on during NFL training camp. We'll highlight them and much more in tomorrow's brand new episode of the show.